The Stamina Dragonknight has, in my opinion, been one of the most flexible classes in the Elder Scrolls Online, when we consider how it's excelled in so many different ways. Having said, it's realistic to say that it hasn't been the top damage dealer in 12-person trials for some time. I'll be upfront, this is still the case, but you can certainly clear all content, get all the achievements, and still do great DPS along the way. For example, here is some footage from a year ago of me throwing rocks at the mage during a VAA score run attempt. Hi, this is Liko, and welcome to my Stamina Dragonknight PVE Build and Rotation video for the Flames of Ambition DLC. Today we are going to showcase 3 different Stamina Dragonknight builds with the courtesy of LordReaper here. There's going to be a lot of variety on show here. Firstly, we will show a 2-hander dual setup, followed by a Bobo setup, then finish off with a Vertitron dual setup. If this sounds good to you, then please consider liking this video and subscribing to myself and LordReaper to help others find this video in the future. LordReaper also has a video that covers StamDK from a different perspective, so I highly recommend you check that out, along with his future content moving forward. Let's begin with showing the fundamental choices of race, Mundus Stone and food. If you're already comfortable with these choices, then do feel free to skip ahead to the first setup. I've left timestamps in the video description to help you move around. So, for the choice of race, Orc used to be the flat out best for stamina DPS, but this is no longer the case. From now, I will recommend either Khajiit or Dunmer as your very top choices. It's a toss up between the two, so honestly go with whichever you prefer out of those. However, having said, Orc really isn't too far behind. It still has some other very useful perks, so if you're currently an Orc, this doesn't mean you have to race change. So for the choice of Mundus Stone, in many cases for stamina DPS, I would recommend the Thief Mundus Stone for extra critical chance. If your crit chance is already pretty high before picking a Mundus Stone, like around 65 or 70%, then you can go with the Shadow Mundus Stone instead for extra critical damage. Now, I can't put an exact number on it, as it will depend on your exact build that you set up with, but if in doubt, I would go with Thief. Choice of food. Now, this will most likely depend on your level of sustain and your HP threshold that you're comfortable running with. If you could do with a little more extra sustain and you don't feel like you need the extra HP, then lava, foot, soup and salt rice would be the way to go. If you're practicing on a target dummy, then I would also recommend selecting this food. If your sustain is decent but you need a little help with it and you need some HP as well, then I would recommend the Artaeum takeaway broth, which gives the best mixture of everything useful. If you don't need any help with your sustain, then you can go with max HP, max stamina food such as braised rabbit with spring vegetables. And this should give you the most DPS as long as you don't run out of resources. I should also mention just in case, but there is also a pure max stamina food, which gives a tiny bit more max stamina than all the previous, but nothing else. It also doesn't last as long, so for most people this is not worth it. An example of this is the Hearty Garlic Corn Chowder. Alright, so let's dive straight into setup 1. For all of these setups, by the way, I believe we will be a Dunmer in choice of race. On our head and shoulders, we are using 2 individual monster set pieces for crit chance. Slimecraw is your best choice for one, and Grunwolf is a recommendation for the second. You could also use Marslock, which will do pretty well in a 12-person raid group. On our body, we will have Reliquin as our 5-piece, classic, and here we are also using 5 pieces of Advancing Yokida or Berserking Warrior, with a 2-hander more on the front bar. You can also use a greatsword if you are able to hit the physical penetration cap. Axe isn't really worth it using anymore, since there is no such thing as the axe bleed anymore, which was one really attractive feature of the 2-hand weapons in recent times. I believe we are using the Shadow Mundus here, since this set does provide a ton of crit chance. However, Kinra's with Thief Mundus will also be a really good alternative, and we will see this combo in other setups moving forward. We are also using damage poisons on the front bar. On the back bar, we are using the Black Rose Perfected dual wield weapons, both with an infused trait with 1 poison glyph and 1 flame glyph. For the skills on the front bar, we firstly have Stone Giant. This is our main spell bubble. There is a special debuff associated to this called Stagger, which is quite beneficial to have in 12-person raid groups, since it boosts everyone's damage. Often you will have a Dragonknight Tant that will handle this debuff, but having a StamDK do it is a very viable option too. You need to make sure that this skill is used once every 5 casts to keep up the bonus. The first cast of 3 is always a channeled ground stomp as well, so do bear that in mind. Next we have Venomous Claw, which is like the strongest single target dot in the whole game, I think. Insanely powerful and really cheap as well, thanks to the Combustion passive, which restores 500 stamina when you inflict poison status effect, and the World and Ruin passive, which decreases cost of all poison abilities by 25%. And yeah, this StamDK has a bunch of those. It lasts 14 seconds, and actually I don't believe the tooltip itself accounts for the increase in damage over time, so again, bear that in mind. Consuming Trap is a magica costing single target dot that does physical damage. It lasts 10 seconds and is good to have since it does really well for your stamina sustain. Executioner is the only two-hander ability that we're actually using. It's really strong, especially in the last 10% of an enemy's HP, but from 40% and below. In this rotation, you can use this skill instead of Stone Giant as your main spammable. But do remember to keep up Stone Giant for the stagger debuff if it's needed. The other morph, Reverse Slice, is also pretty good and might be worth using if there's a lot of trash fights involved. Normally we may have slotted to Wrecking Blow, the two-hander skill line spammable, but we're a little tight in bar space here at the moment, so we're not using it. The fifth skill on this bar is Barb Trap. It gives a passive weapon damage boost thanks to the fighter skill passive, in addition to the nice dot and minor force buff. The ultimate on the front bar is Flawless Dawnbreaker. There again for the fighter's guild passive, but in terms of actual use, you should only really use it if you know you won't be able to charge up and use a Standard of Might, which is what we have on the back bar. And yeah, this is one of the best ultimates in the game. Stand inside it for 15% bonus damage and reduce damage taken by the same amount. Also applies Major Defile and a Synergy and lasts 20 seconds. We then have Molten Whip slotted. This is purely for the Seething Fury passive, which will stack up whenever Noxious Breath, Flames of Oblivion or Standard is cast in this case. This is a flex spot, so should you need bar space for like a heal or something, then this is the one to replace. Next we have Flames of Oblivion. It scales with your highest offensive stats and costs Magicka, so really nice for a stam DK for these reasons. It also fires a second fireball if there is a second enemy to hit, so there is a little cleave as well, which is again nice to have. Noxious Breath is a conal AoE dot with a relatively strong upfront damage portion. It lasts 14 seconds like Venomous Claw and also debuffs the enemy with Major Breach. Next we have Rending Slashes, and this is another 10-second dot from the Dual Wield skill line. And finally we have Deadly Cloak, which is another skill that lasts 10 seconds. Make sure that this ability keeps hitting enemy to gain the bonuses from the Black Rose Dual Wield weapons. You can also use the Maelstrom Bow, by the way, with Endless Hail replacing Deadly Cloak in the event you do not have this weapon. Moving on to the Parse. The premise is to keep up all dots and also have at least one cast of Stagger every 5 seconds. How you do that exactly is up to you, but when I say that, what I mean is if you go with a dynamic rotation, inevitably there will be clashes between skills that need to be recast at the same time, so you can either choose to allow dots to expire in favour of more Stone Giant casts, or recast them early for a better uptime. You can't really go wrong either way. Stam DK has dots of varying lengths, some to be recast after 10, 12, 14, 15 and 18 seconds. It's difficult to be perfect. Below around 40%, you'll want to keep everything up, including Stagger, every 5 seconds, but any extra Stone Giant casts should be replaced with your Executioner in this case. In most real boss fights, of which execute phases are a lot shorter than what you see here on the dummy, you'll want to ensure that all your dots are cast one more time, going into around 25%, and then using Executioner the rest of the way, with a Stone Giant cast here and there if needed. In the description below, I've left 2 static rotations for this. LordReaper has a more complicated static rotation, which should also get you more DPS, and I've left a simpler alternative as well, just in case. Otherwise, if there are any more questions about this setup, we'll love to hear them in the comments, and I'll see you at the end of the pass. Enjoy! Cool, so from the past you can see that Executioner is right there at the top, as you might expect from Execute ability. Over the course of the past it's doing nearly twice as much as per Stone Giant cast. Venomous Claw, as you can see, does a total of around 7.3k DPS, which is extremely strong, and when you think about it, it will also account for a considerable amount of poison damage too, so it's a real must-have. Otherwise, Flames of Oblivion is great value for damage, especially when you consider that it costs Magicka. Overall, there are so many different components of damage from the Stam DK, thanks to all the different various dots and status effects, that they all do add up. As mentioned earlier, we are using the Shadow Mundus here, but again, if you were to use Kinra's instead of advancing Yokida, then you could use this setup with the Thief Mundus instead. You could also use Kinra's as a 5-piece on the body instead of Reliquin, where that's not suitable as well. So plenty of options. The blue CP slottables chosen here are Backstabber, Fighting Finesse, Deadly Aim, and Thaumaturge. Where Backstabber isn't worth using, consider a weapon spell damage slottable instead. Moving on to setup 2 now, this is the Bobo setup. We are using 5 pieces of Kinra's, the new 5-piece set from the Black Drake Villa dungeon. An alternative here is Zogvins, which if you choose to use, you can use the Shadow Mundus Stone instead of the Thief. This set gives you Major Berserk, and your teammates around you Minor Berserk as well, which is pretty damn handy. The 2 to 4 piece set bonuses are also very solid. The second 5-piece is on the body, and that's Reliquin as before. In the fights that are not pure single target, you can also consider Zogvin as a replacement here, and apply the same logic as I mentioned a second ago with the Mundus Stones. Our front bar bow is the Black Rose Perfected Bow. Basically, whenever you use Magnum Shot, you leave a really strong damage over time effect on the enemy. Worth mentioning at this point that when you use Scatter Shot, you shouldn't bar swap until the attack has impacted on the enemy, or else you won't get the bleed. As well as that, the further away you are, the longer the bleed lasts for, but where you get it easy actually when fighting large bosses such as Olms in Asylum or the Dragons in Sandspire, as the distance is supposedly calculated from the middle of the box's hitbox, and they are huge hitboxes. So essentially you can get away with a pretty good bonus even if you are in melee range in such fights. For the backbar weapon, we have the trusty old Maelstrom Bow. This allows the damage for Endless Hail to ramp up for the majority of the duration, so do aim to keep this up, which also procs to your enchants as well. In terms of skills, on the front bar we are using Lethal Arrow as our main spammable. It's a channeled ability, but you can weave it like a normal ability as long as you don't attempt to queue up the next light attack too early. Acid Spray is a 4-second AoE dot, but with a relatively significant upfront damage portion. So you can treat this like a semi-spammable to be cast whenever there is nothing else that needs refreshing, essentially. Magnum Shot is the skill buffed by the Black Rose Bow. Be aware of the duration of the special dot and then refresh it as soon as it needs refreshing again. This is probably your top priority. We have then Poison Injection, which is kind of weak when the enemy is above 50%, but has an execute mechanic built in that starts when the enemy is below that 50% threshold. By the way, these poison abilities are super cheap considering that you also have a Magicka costing ability on the bar as well. The Stamp Sustain is going to be really good overall. And next we have Barb Trap, which is a decent dot in its own right that gives us minor force as well, but yeah, can be a flex spot if you're using Zogvin. And the ultimate usage is the same as before, but be aware that for Standard of Might you might need to double check that you are standing inside the standard and that the standard is also hitting the boss. On the back bar we have Endless Hail. Keep this up to allow our back bar enchant to keep proccing as well as getting the Maelstrom Bow effect. And yeah, looking at the rest of these skills, they are the same as before in the first setup. Venomous Claw and Noxious Breath you'll need to be kind of close to melee to use, so keep that in mind. Moving on to the Parse, Stam DK is a funny one to play with Bobo, as you'll want to be a mixture of being at distance for the bow distance passive plus the Black Rose Prison Bow bonus, yet you'll want to be close up to make sure that you use up some of the Stam DK dots and also Standard of Might. Again, in fights against big bosses with big hitboxes, this isn't really an issue. The Stam DK Bobo rotation seems to be in line with other weapon types for Stam DK, so certainly a very viable solution for those who want the flexibility of being in melee but also being very capable at range. As said before, your biggest priority will be keeping up the Black Rose Bow Virulent Shot effect, followed by Endless Hail. Otherwise, do your best with keeping up all the other dots and use Acid Spray as frequently as possible, followed by Lethal Arrow when there's absolutely nothing else that needs to be cast. I can understand that there is a lot going on. Stam DK isn't the most straightforward to play, even without Stone Giant and Stacker in this case, as you can see. Again, there will also be a static rotation in the description below. It's probably the most simple static rotation out of the showcases here, so do give it a go and let me know what you think. And again, if you have any questions, then yeah, give me a shout in the comments. I'll catch up with you at the end of the pass to give my thoughts on what we see here, so enjoy. First off, look how powerful Virulent Shot is. It's almost 10k DPS from this Black Rose Prism Bow set alone. Also worth noting as well is that per cast, Acid Spray is doing a fair bit more than Lethal Arrow. As suggested by the tooltip as well, and considering that it's AoE and much cheaper on a Stam DK than other classes, it's overall a really strong skill. And yeah, looking at the rest of the damage, as before, lots of dots and lots of sources of damage coming in and adding up. One of the quirks with the bow setup is that the difficulty of weaving certain skills is really something that can take some getting used to, so you can certainly see the potential here. The blue CP slottables chosen here are the same as before: Backstabber, Fighting Finesse, Deadly Aim and Thaumaturge, and as I said earlier, where Backstabber isn't worth using, consider a weapon and spell damage slottable instead. Moving on to setup 3, this is the Vateshran dagger setup, which did the most DPS out of all 3 displayed here. But again, all setups here are so close that crit chance RNG, and situationally you can consider them all equal. For the gear, the 2 5 pieces on the body are the same as in the previous pass, Kinras and Reliquans. On the front bar we have Vateshran daggers, we have 1 Nunhood and 1 sharpened. Poisons are used on this bar, so we don't need to worry about the enchants. Precise is also viable if you don't need the sharpened enchant if you are reaching pen cap. From 75% enemy HP and below, casts of Shrouded Daggers will be stronger than Stone Giant, and will continue to get stronger as the boss's HP goes down. From 50% and below, you'll also gain that large proportion of your stamina back, around half of it, so it becomes a pretty cheap cast as well. The lower the HP, the more it will also outperform certain dots, and I'll discuss that more during the pass. On the back bar, we are using a Black Rose dual wield, both infused with a flame and poison glyph like in the first setup. Skill wise, I think the only new thing here is the use of Shrouded Daggers. As mentioned earlier, this will become your primary spammable over Stone Giant from 75% and below. If you do not need to use Stone Giant for stagger, then you can drop it altogether. This skill offers pretty good cleave as well, since the daggers can bounce off and hit nearby enemies. Every other skill we've seen before, Except comparing to the two-hander setup, we have moved Rending Slashes to the front bar and Venomous Claw to the back bar to enable a slightly higher Seething Fury uptime, the Molten Whip passive. Rotation-wise, overall it's actually pretty close to the first build with two-hander. You keep up all your dots, with a particular focus on ensuring Deadly Cloak is cast every 12 seconds to keep up the Black Rose dual effect, and the damage from the back bite enchant as well. Otherwise, keeping up stagger stacks with a Stone Giant cast at least once every 5 seconds is even more important in the context of 12-person groups. Otherwise, keeping up Seething Fury is kinda easier here, as you'll have Venomous Claw in addition to Noxious Breath and Flames of Oblivion on your back bar. You can try to keep up the buff by either spreading out these casts, or you can consecutively cast them for a stronger burst, or you can just play without thinking about it, and to be honest, all of these will work pretty well. When the boss is below 75% HP, you'll want to incorporate Shrouded Daggers into the rotation, dropping all Stone Giant casts if you're not in charge of keeping up stagger for your group, or if you are, only keeping up those that are needed to keep up the uptime. At around 50% HP, when the sustained benefit of Radishran Daggers kicks in, we can drop Consuming Trap since it also does more damage per cast at this point as well. Again, I appreciate there is so much going on here, so I have left 2 static rotations in the description below. The first is courtesy of LordReaper, which is a little more complex, but more optimal. The second is a simpler one to remember, but may not pull as high DPS. Stamp DK is probably slightly more awkward to make a static rotation for, since there are just so many considerations. Anyway, that's what I have to say here. Again, do ask if you have any questions in the comments below, and I'll catch you at the end of this pass. So yeah, as you may have very well expected, Shrouded Daggers comes up top with the average hit of the skill, highlighting just how useful the ability is. Essentially, we were slowly executing from 75% onwards while slightly simplifying the rotation by being able to drop Consuming Trap halfway through. The breakdown of the rest of the skills are fairly similar as before. Seething Fury stacks do have a higher uptime here compared to the two-handed pass as well, thanks to the change in skill bars that the double dual wield affords us. The blue CP slottables chosen here are the same as before. I'll let it play through again, but they are Backstabber, Fighting Finesse, Deadly Aim and Thaumaturge, and again, where Backstabber isn't worth using, consider a weapon and spell damage slottable instead. Alright, so thanks for taking your time to watch this video. I hope it helped you set up your Stamina Dragonknight today for the Flames of Ambition DLC. Thanks again to LordReaper for providing the footage, and a quick reminder at this point to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to our channels, and then go and see what LordReaper has to say about Stamina DK. All my other builds for this DLC will be left in the description below at some point. Anyway, this is Liko, stay safe and take care. See you soon.